going to write it to the Kennel bookstore, but it's a wonderful book, new book that he's going to be speaking about obviously tonight. We're going to start in just a couple more minutes. Just want to make sure that we get everybody in. Remember that you should have a parking permit. So tonight, this is really going to be the only night in our future events where we're going to need a parking permit at this point. So the rest of them on Friday nights usually do not require parking permits because after 4 o'clock on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, the university does not check parking. Just in case you ever come to campus, you don't need a parking permit. Let's wait just a couple more minutes. While you're doing that, you can take a look at our upcoming events, and I'll tell you a little bit more in just 2 more minutes while we wait to get everybody in.
It's cotton poly. They're all cotton poly. Unfortunately, I'm the same way. I like 100% cotton.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you did a nice job.
Yeah.
So these are the three colors.
It's very soft. You know.
Oh, it's just like a fleece.
Yeah.
That's nice.
So good evening, everyone. We're going to get started this evening. Welcome to our spring lecture series of the Armenian Studies program. I'm Professor Derma Grdichin. Today we have actually 4 Armenian Studies professors in the room, so I'd like to introduce them all because some of them will be still presenting the rest of the semester. Starting in the fall of this year, our new professor, our Haig and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies, is Dr. David Zakarian. Dr. Zakarian. He'll be giving a talk later this semester, hopefully in April, I think we're talking about. May even, early May, okay. And then we have Dr. Hagop Ohanessian, who's been with the program now for 10 years, Dr. Ohanessian, who teaches Armenian 148 and Armenian Studies 10. These are our 2 of our main courses in the program. And then we're very happy to have with us this semester our Kazan visiting professor, the 21st Kazan visiting professor, Dr. Talin Sujan. Dr. Sujan. And actually, she's going to be speaking this Friday night. Yeah, this Friday night, February the 28th. And that's going to be in the first place that she spoke, the same place, which is in the Smith Camp Alumni House. If you ever need directions, you don't know how to get to places, you can always just follow us on Facebook. We give the directions. And if you have any questions, you can follow it. She's going to be talking about continuing her discussion of the series on Armenian family archives, this time focusing on a series of postcards. And she'll be speaking about the postcards of a certain family living in Canada, and she'll talk about that coming up. So that's going to take us through February 28th. Then on March the 7th, as you've seen up here, David Karamian is going to visit us from the Bay Area, and David is going to be speaking about his new book, which is called the Lone Star Armenia book, which tells us about the beautiful sites in Armenia. It's kind of a touring book, a book about Armenia. What are the beautiful places to visit? Very beautiful book, and he's got some of his other books as well, which also deal with those same topics. And that will take us through March 7th. And then on March 16th will be our Armenian Studies program banquet. And then we still have 2 more lectures following that. We have on March 21st, Dr. Hakim Al-Rustam, who is the Manugian Professor of Armenian Studies from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And he's written a new book about the identity of Armenians in Turkey and how that's changed over time. And then following that, Dr. Sujan will give the 3rd in her 3-part series on March 28th. So all of those you'll hear about. Let me just switch the PowerPoint and then I'll introduce our speaker. So tonight we're going to hear a very interesting presentation because it's on a topic that probably all of you are familiar with, the Armenian Genocide, but it's going to be taking a look at how the United States has dealt with the topic of the genocide over the past several decades, actually all the way from the early part of the 20th century. But our speaker will talk about that, so I'd like to just introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Julien Zarifian is a professor in U.S. History and Civilization at the University of Poitiers in France, and a fellow at the Institut Universitaire de France. And he's the author of 2 books in French and has published dozens of academic articles in journals such as Société Hérédité, European Journal of American Studies, and the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. Just because you're thinking he's going to do it in French, the speeches tonight presentation is in English, and the book is in English, so it's going to be a great presentation. We look forward to his presentation and thank him. He's been traveling all over the United States. Actually, he's been based in Washington, D.C. Maybe you can tell a little bit about what you've been doing in Washington. And then just yesterday he was in UCLA. Tomorrow he's going to be speaking at USC, and he's doing a tour pretty much of the Armenian Studies institutions in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julien Zarifian. Dr. Zarifian.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much, dear Barlow, for this introduction. I'm extremely happy to be here. Of course, I want to thank first and foremost Barlow Dermagerdician and the Armenian Studies program here at Fresno State. We've been in touch for a long time, Barlow and I have wanted to come and visit here Fresno State and the Armenian Studies program for, well, probably about a decade, and it's been postponed for a variety of reasons, but anyway, today I'm extremely happy to be here and extremely happy to present my book. So as Barlow explained, I'm a professor in US history, US civilizations with a focus on politics in France, and currently based in Washington, D.C. for the semester. I'm a visiting fellow with American University in D.C. So that's why, being on US soil, I take this opportunity to visiting some colleagues basically, and so I'm happy to be here, especially in this Armenian environment. Although I presume that my book is also very much about the United States, and you'll see it throughout the talk, and if you have the opportunity to read the book, you'll see that it's also very much about the US, and I believe it tells a lot about the United States as well, about the Armenian Genocide, not so much as an historical topic or historical object, but as a political and geopolitical one, but also very much about the US and the way the US deals with history. Anyway, so my idea tonight, is to keep it simple and casual. I'll try not to speak too long and not to get too much into detail, like, methodological detail, theoretical detail, blah, blah, blah. My idea is to tell you about the contents of the book, the main points, some, conclusion, of course, the findings, but also maybe, and to get started with, I would like to tell you a bit about the story of the book, the story behind the book, how I did to, I did get to the topic and then decide to research on the topic and then to write a book, a study that would eventually take the shape of a book on this topic, because I think it's interesting, and also because I'm sure that this is a question that you have or you may have, how a French scholar, of Armenian background with my name and so on, but still a French scholar, ended up researching and writing a book on this issue of the US and the Armenian Genocide. So when I said US and the Armenian Genocide here, I want to insist on the fact that I focus mostly on the question of what I labeled, in a way, the question of non-recognition of the Armenian Genocide by the United States. The book starts with the historical part and the US policies and reactions to the Armenian Genocide when it took place, but most of the study and most of the book is about the policy of non-recognition of the Armenian Genocide by the US, mostly from the late 60s, early 70s, when it was sort of formalized onwards until recognition by Congress in 2019 and the President Joe Biden in 2021. Anyway, so it all started, for me, it all started by a sort of basic question, and that came to mind when my country, France, was itself in the process of recognizing the Armenian genocide back to the late 90s, early 2000s. And actually, France formally recognized the Armenian genocide by a vote by the Senate in 2001. So I just put the slide, you know, just for you to have the slide, and also I found it interesting, although it's not central to my topic at that stage, but I found it interesting to compare the bill, I mean the law in France and the resolution in the United States, because as you can see it or guess it, there is an article unique, that is to say only one article, one sentence in the case of France. La France reconnaît publiquement le génocide arménien en 1915. France recognizes publicly the Armenian genocide of 1915, period. Whereas the idea in America was totally different, as you can see it. It's very much developed, you have context, you have... So anyway, that's just something interesting that we may discuss. Of course, in the case of the US bill, you have the perpetrators mentioned, for example, which is not the case of the French bill. But the French bill is powerful in a way because it's simple and it's sober, if I may use this term. Anyway, so it all started for me at that moment because I was myself at that time a student, undergrad student actually in 2001. I was interested in Armenian-related issues, especially Armenian genocide and political questions in general. So I was following the debates in my country. And I, of course, realized that it was difficult to get this Armenian genocide recognized in France. I realized that Turkey was very much involved in lobbying against, in many different ways, and lobbying against politicians, of course, in Paris, but also civil society, the media, and so on. So I realized that there was definitely an issue. But I also realized actually two things. First, in France recognized the Armenian genocide, so it was possible to do it. And in any case, France was not the first country doing this. And second point, I also realized that France, that basically not much happened to France when France recognized the Armenian genocide. Nothing or not much, to be more precise, and to be not much happened. So that's how and why I started to have this question: why does the US not recognize the Armenian genocide? At that time, why has the US not recognized the Armenian genocide yet? So that was a basic question. But actually, this question became the research question 20 years later of the book. Not exactly the same way, of course. The research question of the book is more sophisticated, more academic, intellectual in a way. But at the end of the day, this is this fundamental question that I wanted to, really answer to. Why? And then, so 20 years later, the question was something like why it took so long for the United States to recognize the Armenian genocide. But in a few slides, you'll see the main research question of the book. But anyway, that's how it all started. So when you're an undergraduate student in history, and even later actually, once then postgraduate students and PhD students, when you have this type of question, what you do is trying to find answers in books and other publications. So I started to check what I could find, as far as, so first of all, academic publications, and I found it almost none. Okay, there was no academic publication in the 2000s, and actually even later, dealing with this question and really, exploring the question of the reasons why the US had not recognized the Armenian genocide. So I found a few newspaper articles, not a few actually, quite many, because of course in the US, as you probably know it, every year, almost every year, and sometimes several times a year, you had a resolution that was presented in Congress and actually blocked and rejected. That's something I will discuss in a few minutes. But anyway, so that generated a lot of newspaper articles. So I read the newspaper article. I also read a few other documents from that time, or maybe a bit later, you know, in the mid-2000s, I started to read other primary sources, congressional record document, and so on. But anyway, and so basically, I read what I could find, that is to say not much, but a lot of newspaper articles, op-eds, and so on. And I realized that the only response to this question, why the US does not recognize the Armenian genocide, was basically even more basic than the question. It was one word: Turkey. Okay? So if the US had not recognized the Armenian genocide, it was basically because of Turkey. And to make it short and simple, but I'll get back to this in a few minutes, it was this, you know, geopolitical arguments. The importance of Turkey, NATO member, and close ally to the US, and as Turkey is was extremely, and still is today, extremely firm and even vehement on the question of international recognition of the Armenian genocide, there was no reason for the US to risk any, you know, trouble, difficulty with what was always presented as a major, indispensable ally. Well, it was an answer, and that is an answer, and this is for sure the main point, the main determinant. In other words, of course, without Turkey, everything would have been different. The question would have not been raised this way, but without Turkish denial and so on. But of course, without Turkey, it would have been easier, and it wouldn't have been a problem for the United States to recognize the Armenian genocide. I mean, I think we don't know, but so of course Turkey was central. But from that very time, I mean the early 2000s and then the 2000s and early 2010 and so on, this simple answer, I mean, I started to find this answer not really convincing. First, if it was only about geopolitics, it needed to be proven. It needed to be discussed, academically speaking, because, I mean, geopolitics is a complex thing. Geopolitics is also a matter of narratives, as you know it. And anyway, so it needed to be really, really discussed academically. And in any case, I had this intuition that it may not be the only reason. That although I knew at that time that it was probably the main reason, that Turkey was probably the main reason why the US had not recognized the genocide, there may be other parameters, let's say, to study. So that's basically how I started to have this idea that some scholarship was needed on the topic. And, you know, progressively, I had this idea that as it had not been discussed at all, almost at all, I'm going to say a few words about the books that you can see on the screen. I may be actually the good person to undertake this, you know, academic project. At that time, I was recruited as an associate professor in 2011. My interest was clearly US history, political history, recent history. At the same time, I had already this background and even modestly expertise on the Armenian genocide, and I was involved in at least some aspect of what we call Armenian studies. And so I had this idea that I started to have this idea that I may be the good person to work on the topic. Whereas at the same time, as I said before, we did not have much. Actually, to be honest, we had nothing on the very question I was asking, but a few books and also academic articles on topics, let's say, close to or with approaches that would be close to mine, but not the same. Most of the books we had were basically history books, okay, whose focus was the US reaction to the Armenian genocide when it took place, and then to the 20s and early 30s, with, I'd say, as a major piece of research, piece of work, Simon Payaslian's book, that I use very much in the first part of my, or the first sections, let's say, of the book, the first chapters of the book. And then the only chapters or book sections dealing with the Armenian genocide as a political subject, the question of the recognition, Armenian genocide as a political subject, were a few chapters in Richard Ovanesyan's series of books on the Armenian genocide, especially this one. And I'm thinking in particular of a chapter by Vigen Guroyan, who discussed basically the question, not exactly the way I wanted to, but still relatively close. And a few chapters as well in Michael Bobelian's very important book, Children of Armenia. But again, the approach was very different, as Bobelian did not focus only on the US, and as his goal was not so much to understand the reasons behind this US non-recognition policy. But anyway, so we had a few books, but really not much. So basically, I had the topic in mind. I had this main question, research question, that actually becomes the one that you can see here, top of the screen. I had well, pardon me. The main question actually is here. I don't know how this works. Yeah, the main question's here, and that would be more the approach. So, okay, I had the main question. I had this sort of hypothesis that maybe Turkey was not enough as a determinant of this US non-recognition policy, so that would be a sort of main hypothesis. So I had to find an approach, and as you can see it on the board, I opted for what we call a diachronic approach, that is to say, taking a topic on its long run, okay, not focusing on one episode or one whatever period, or so I decided to do it this way. Maybe I can say a few words about that. I think it's important. Again, the topic had not been discussed, academically speaking, so I had this feeling that I had to do it completely, you know, over the 50, 60 years we're talking about, roughly from the 60s, as I said before, onwards, and even starting before, okay? Because I had this idea, maybe, I mean, I could have done otherwise, and I hesitated quite much. But I had this idea that I had first to do this, like, to clear the ground, not only set, but to clear the ground first. Another possibility, as I implied it before, was to, or would have been to focus on one, for example, one president. And there is much to be done. So that's what I did in the book, but I did it over, like, I don't know, maybe 10 pages per president, to make it short. But I think a book on Ronald Reagan and the Armenian Genocide would be a great book, actually. Or, I mean, a great study list. I don't know if it may become a book, but I think it could. I mean, I like Reagan as an example, but that could be another president, or the approach could be more institutional as well. I mean, as you probably know, or as you can guess, political science and political history, when it comes to US history, is or are extremely developed as fields. So that could very well be the Armenian Genocide and what it tells about the tension between the executive branch and the legislative branch. It could very well be, depending on the archives, it could very well be the State Department and the Armenian Genocide. I mean, there are so many studies that could be done, and that could be, well, interesting. And I'm sure they will be well received by scholars in US, you know, US history, US political history, ethnic studies as well. I mean, the role of lobbies in that question, especially the Armenian lobby. So I modestly published a book on that topic in 2014, but it's understudied, completely understudied. the role also of Turkish lobbying and so on. Anyway, so there would have many different possibilities, but I had this idea, and I'm happy I did it this way, because I'm happy with the, maybe not the contents of the book, I'm not saying it's a great book, but I'm happy with the shape of the book, so I'm happy I decided to do this way, you know, diachronic approach, long run, long term, but it could have been done differently. But anyway, I opted for this approach. Okay, so I had the topic, research question, hypothesis, approach. So now, and of course I started before, but there was the issue of the sources, the primary, secondary as well, but primary sources in particular, and then the question of the architecture, let's say, of the book, the outline of the book. So with regards to the archives, I mean to the primary sources, I focused on well, the archives from the executive, what was available at that time. That is to say, sometimes quite a lot, sometimes you don't really know actually if that could possibly be more. How we say it, sorry, it's late and I'm a bit tired and I'm looking for the word I would like to use now. You know, when an archive is secret or top secret, or there is a delay before. Oh man, no.
Classified?
Yeah, the classification, the classification of archives. When it comes to the Armenian Genocide, it's a complex issue, and only the Armenian Genocide. Anyway, so I could access quite a lot, especially through the presidential libraries, although the National Archives are in DC and also online and so on, but it's easy to go, it's often easier to go through the materials of the presidential libraries. Then, of course, congressional report for the legislative branch, and also documents related to committees, you know, congressional committees, hearings in particular, and so on. So that's what I had. Then also, well, not at the end, but probably the middle of I had already started to write actually the book when the archive of the Dashnak magazines, Hayrenik first and Armenian Weekly, were digitized, and so I could use this, and at the same time I also used the same but not digitized for the Armenian Mirror Spectator, so that I had both point of view, in a way, Dashnak and Ramgavar and non-Dashnak. So that was extremely useful, and this material is quite remarkable, because basically these two newspapers, in Armenian and in English, started in the early, I mean for the English version, it's the early 30s for both Armenian Mirror Spectator and Hayrenik, and then Armenian Weekly. So this is quite an exceptional, you know, material. So anyway, I used it a lot, and it was extremely useful. I found details, I could find names, dates, and so on, that I wouldn't have had access otherwise. So that was really precious. And then last but not least, I did 27 interviews in DC mostly, but also Los Angeles, so for the most recent parts, with lobbyists, congresspersons, the entourage of congresspersons, a few people from the executive branch, but it was more difficult, but I got access. I could talk to a few people from the State Department as well. So that basically that's what were my primary sources. And then so I had to think of an outline. Here again, I had to think a lot about it, of course. I mean, that's the way you organize your ideas, even though you have your main points, arguments, but the way you organize everything counts a lot, of course, for a book. So I decided to do it mostly chronologically, and then I say mostly because the last part of the book, which is actually the longest one, is no longer chronological, more let's say, thematic. And so the first section, the first parts, let's say, are mostly chronological, analytical, and the last part more thematic. Basically, the last part really focuses on the reasons why it's been so long for the US to recognize the Armenian genocide, whereas the first parts are about analyzing the processes in DC, mostly with regards to this non-recognition of the Armenian genocide. So the book is divided into 6 parts, but for tonight I decided that, and not only for tonight, I mean, although I have 6 parts in the book, it's divided into 3 chapters, that is to say 18 chapters. I think the book can be summed up and divided in the end this way into 3 parts. An historical one, let's say. So this one is important, it sets the ground, but it is probably not where I bring the best and the newest things, because the topic had already been discussed quite much, so I use mostly secondary sources, although primary sources as well, and I try to say, I mean, to add my 5 cents on this topic. I'll say a few words later. Then the core of the book, the core part of the book is the second one, political struggle for genocide recognition by the United States, and then the reasons why it took so long. So let me develop a bit each of these parts. Just a few, I mean, it's just iconography, not direct. I'm not gonna talk directly of all these, pictures. It's just basic iconography for you to have something to look at and to also think of in addition to what I said. So basically, as I said before, I did not bring anything really new, or maybe did I a bit. Basically, what I tried to show in this part is that, as we know it, there was some empathy from the West to the plight of the Armenians, definitely. There was some political support to some extent. There was a strong humanitarian support, for sure. But at the end of the day, what I tried to show is that the political support was a more complex issue than what we can have in mind, and should be nuanced. And actually, it's clear that, especially on the side of the executive, there was some interest at different moments to support the case and the cause of Armenia. But there was also a lot of hesitations, especially from Congress, even within the administration. And in the end, the support was not full and was not constant throughout the years. And that's something interesting. I'll get back to this later. When it comes to congressional recognition of the Armenian genocide. Anyway, so that's basically what this first part is about. So I'm not insisting more. We could discuss it a bit if you like, but to be honest, it's not the central part, and it's the shortest, definitely, part of the book. So what is more significant in this study is precisely the study of how the question of the recognition of the Armenian genocide, I'm not talking of the Armenian cause in its diversity, complexity, I'm really talking of the Armenian recognition as genocide, the recognition of the Armenian genocide as such, became a sort of topical issue in Washington, D.C. So I said that. So actually, I think that this main second part of this book, although I told you that there were 6 parts, but this main second segment of the book can be either started in 1965, as it is most of the time the case. This renewal of the Armenian question for this 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide and so on. And that's definitely a possibility. Now, I also studied quite much the 40s and the 50s, which tend to be a bit neglected, but I think they're important when it comes to the emergence or re-emergence, I don't know how to call it, of the Armenian cause, and especially in relation to the Armenian genocide. So obviously the 40s are crucial. I mean, it's a crucial decade because you had the Holocaust, the genocide of European Jews that played an important role in making the Armenian genocide not topical again, but definitely I'd say topical, because of course that's when many Armenian leaders in particular, the press, realized that what happened to Armenians was exactly genocide. Then you had the UN Convention on Genocide of 1948 that also played an important role in this sort of revival. So what's interesting here is that although I could develop, and that's something I discuss at length in the book, but at that time the question of naming it as genocide was not central. I could almost say at all. It was not central at all at that time. And actually, when you read the press, and even up to the 60s, even Armenian American leaders, they don't systematically use the term genocide, and it does not seem to be central at that stage. Turkish authorities and so on have already organized a sort of denial campaign, but it's not so much denial of the genocide as a term or as a concept. It's more a denial of the Armenian massacres, or not always denial, but anyway. So the focus at that time, neither for the Armenian camp nor for the others, Turkey, the Turkish camp, let's say, and the others, the term genocide is not so central at that time. And then you have 65. I'm not insisting, that's something we can discuss. But anyway, I think the key moment for this very topic of the Armenian genocide recognition in the US is here. This is the pivotal moment, in my opinion. So we're in 73, 74, and you have a subcommission of the United Nations in New York City, whose goal is to discuss, to produce a report on genocide and genocides, and which basically decided not to add the Armenian case, the Armenian genocide, to the list, to make it simple. That's not exactly what they here, but it doesn't matter. But so this subcommission decided not to add the Armenian case to the list of past genocide in its introduction, in the introduction of the report, or in the preamble, I think, of the report. Armenian Americans were there in New York, and of course they could not accept this, and more significantly, they could not, and that does not appear on screen in the article, but they could not accept that the US delegate to this subcommission, voted against including the Armenian genocide. So that's, if you think about it, that should have been almost a known topic, a known subject. I mean, we're talking of a report by a UN subcommission that basically nobody would have read, and that was not something super central, geopolitically speaking, and so on. But the fact that the US followed and followed the pressure from the Turkish delegate and a few others, especially the Pakistani one and also the Tunisian one in this subcommission, the fact that the US did not accept, refused to, rejected, the case of the Armenian genocide, was highly problematic for Armenian Americans. And when I say Armenian Americans at that time, we can already talk, of course, of an organized committee with mainly already at that time two lobbies, the Armenian Assembly of America that was created roughly at that time in 1972, and you already had the Dashnak, Armenian National Committee of America, who would be reshaped significantly in the 70s, 80s, but that already existed. So anyway, for these people in particular, and other people among the Armenian community or communities in the US, it was not acceptable. So they knew already, of course, that the executive branch, because when we said, but when we said that the American delegate to this commission refused to add the Armenian genocide to the list, it means that behind him, of course, you have the executive branch, you have the State Department, at least the State Department, possibly more, but at least the State Department. For a UN subcommission, and I think it's only the State Department at that time. But I don't know, actually. They may have already have been backed. We don't know. I don't know at that stage, but backed by the President Nixon, and so on. But anyway, so that was in a way the starting point, because because Armenian Americans not only realized that the U.S. executive and the State Department in particular was pro-Turkey, to make it simple, but the fact that it was pro-Turkey make it refuse to recognize the Armenian genocide. And that became a serious issue for the U.S. For U.S. lobbyists and so on, who started at that time to make of it a sort of matter of principle, okay? And the U.S., it was not acceptable that the U.S. did not recognize the Armenian genocide, and that the executive branch opposed recognition this way in a United Nations body, let's say. Anyway, so as they understood that that was basically the line of the executive branch, State Department in particular, they started to focus on Congress, okay, to get this recognized. And here started the beginning of a 50-year, roughly 50-year struggle for and against recognition in Congress. So the pattern was more or less always the same. Basically, the Armenian camp, let's say, to make this simple, proposed a resolution in one of the two houses, or the two houses. Then, immediately after the proposal or the proposition, Turkey and the executive branch lobbied against, and then it was eventually rejected. So that's the pattern. But now what's interesting, and that's basically what I see in this book, and I found it, as you can imagine, I found it fascinating to study. Every episode is different. The Armenian camp changed its tactics many times. They opted for different wording, for example. They opted for different timing. Sometimes they were backed by, I mean, the resolution was backed by hundreds of representatives in the House, sometimes by a small number of them. They worked on alliances very hard, and alliances, lobbying alliances with other groups, other people. They eventually created a caucus on Armenian issues in the House. It was in 1995. And also, what's fascinating with this story, actually, is that they never gave up. I mean, every time, we're talking of dozens of failures, okay? But they never gave up. They always tried again. And by doing this, they sent a very significant signal or message to the opponents. Basically, they said, we won't give up. And when there'll be a possibility, when there'll be a window, we'll be here and we'll eventually succeed. And that's what happened in 2019. So basically, that's what this big part, big second part or segment of the studies. And then the last part of the book is, as I said before, about the reasons why it took so long for the US to recognize the Armenian genocide. Because I was talking, I've just said a few words about this idea of perseverance, of the Armenian community and its leaders on this very question. What's also fascinating is the continuity in Washington, D.C. in this policy. And it's quite rare. I mean, the same policy, the same line for 50 years approximately, no matter the geopolitical context, no matter the political party in power in Congress or White House and so on. The US executive maintained its policy for about 50 years. Again, Nixon, Obama, Trump, Clinton, Bush 41, Bush 43 alike. That's a very interesting case when you think about it. Anyway, so then the last part is about these reasons, because that's something I didn't say before in the first parts of my talk, but what fascinated me, you know, when I started to get interested in the topic, was this very continuity. And that's also why I had this intuition that Turkey may not be the only parameter. I mean, okay, Turkey, geopolitical pressure, blah, blah, blah. In one case, or two cases, or 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but we're talking of 50 years of the same, you know, firm policy by the executive branch. I mean, of course, there were nuances, and that's something I developed at length in the book. We all know, for example, that Obama's position on the Armenian Genocide was very different from, well, the Trump one in 2016-20, when he was for his first mandate. So there were differences, but basically, still, the executive branch maintained its position and its policy. Anyway, so basically, I divided my arguments into three main, let's say, categories of reasons why the US did not recognize the Armenian Genocide. Of course, first, I discussed the geopolitical one, or the geopolitical arguments. And of course, I come to the conclusion that indeed, that was central. The fact that, yeah, Turkey, as we know it, Turkey was a major, and still is a major, Eurasian stakeholder, you know, player, both during the Cold War, context of the Cold War, but also after the Cold War and the end of bipolarity, so on. Turkey maintained its place and its importance. So you have purely military reasons, strategic reasons, geopolitics reasons. You have geoeconomy through pipelines, and Turkey is obviously central in this, you know, major project, especially in the 90s, to get access to Caspian resources, Central Asian resources, to transport it or them, gas and oil, towards Western market. And so I discussed all this. I also showed that this geopolitical argument was sometimes also used by the executive branch as a sort of card to play against Turkey. In other words, we have at least two situations in which the US executive branch basically says to Turkey, okay, don't do what we want you to do, we won't push Congress for not recognizing the Armenian Genocide, we will let Congress recognize the Armenian Genocide. We have two cases. One actually was Trump recently, I mean, first mandate, of course, but a few years ago. The other was George W. Bush. There may be other examples, but so that's basically what I discuss in these sections. But I also insist on the fact, and this is the second category of arguments. I also insist on the fact that, well, first I said that basically geopolitics per se is not that much. What counts is also the narrative or narratives behind geopolitics. In other words, you need people to explain why it's not only that Turkey is important, it's people who are going to explain why it is important and who are concretely backing this position in Washington, D.C., and so on. So I'm not saying that there is no like obvious, let's say, geographically speaking, demographically speaking, you have data and to take into account. But still, behind every geopolitical point, you have a narrative. It's obvious. And in the case of, so that's something I explained. I mean, from even before the Second World War, but then in the 40s, you had people, especially at the State Department or close to the State Department, who started to push for this idea of a sort of super centrality of Turkey in Eurasia and so on. So that's something I developed. And then, in an even more concrete way, you have, of course, lobbying. Again, that's one thing to have a sort of position in DC, but if it's not backed by significant lobbying and lobbyists, you may not get what you're looking for. So basically, we had a really strong and multifaceted Turkish lobbying in DC that took really many different shapes, not only focusing on the question of US recognition of the genocide, focusing on many other aspects. Greece, for example, Cyprus, and so on. This is quite well known, but still we know that a significant part of Turkish lobbying in DC was against recognition of the Armenian genocide. At the same time, you also had, as you know it, a significant Armenian lobbying that also played a role. That's something we could discuss, of course, if you like. And again, that put this question at the top as a top priority, to its agenda, and that showed again perseverance and diversified its techniques and its approaches and so on. Also, I discuss in this second categories of determinants, I discuss the role, and this is a difficult question to be honest, but I discuss it at length in the book, the role of Israel, pro-Israeli, let's say Jewish pro-Israeli lobbying in DC, and also the important question of the uniqueness of the Holocaust that played a role in US non-recognition, especially in the 80s, 90s. You had many people at that time who wanted the Holocaust to be the only genocide and therefore refused the Armenian genocide to be recognized as such. And we have many very clear and very concrete examples in Congress. I mean, congresspersons, for example, who raised this argument to justify their vote against recognition of Armenian genocide up to the 2000s, I said, but mostly in the 1980s and 90s. So that's what you have. This is the second categories of reasons I discussed. And the last one, and the one that I found the most stimulating personally when I researched on the question, read and so on, is basically the fact that the US has a difficult relationship to the past in general, and first and foremost to its own past, and that concretely it has played a role. Again, we have a few interesting examples. It has played a role in non-recognition of the Armenian genocide, especially in Congress. Maybe also the executive branch, but this I don't know. I mean, I have a few hints, let's say, for especially the State Department. But for Congress, it's very clear. In other words, you have congresspersons who, in very explicit terms, say that, well, before recognizing the tragedies of the past of other peoples and nations and so on, we should focus on ours. And referring clearly to slavery and also, of course, the question of the destruction of Native Americans. So that was a very interesting and, as I said, stimulating part. And also I liked it because it replaced, in a way, or it placed the question of the Armenian genocide within a broader picture. The one of basically how we collectively memorialize past tragedies, okay, genocides in particular. So that's a point I really enjoyed working on and discussing. And that's also when I came to realize something quite obvious, but that's something, this is actually things the most obvious that we need to be clear on and to discuss and to write on and to, you know, in explicit terms and so on. Basically, it was asked to the United States, through the Congress in particular, to recognize the Armenian Genocide that took place in the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century, whereas not at the same time, but not that far, the US itself, as a country, as a state, had participated in destroying its indigenous population. So there is obviously something intriguing here, and not intriguing, actually problematic, right? So that's what I discussed quite much in the last sections of the book. So that's about it. Maybe just to conclude, that's basically two extract from the first one is an extract from the conclusion of this book. Actually, these are precisely the last lines, the very last lines of the conclusion, therefore of the book. And this one is a piece of conclusion that I wrote for a book chapter in French a bit later, although it was published the same year. But anyway, in this very last words, I said that basically the US did not lose much, to say the least, by recognizing the Armenian Genocide. I mean, it did the right thing, the thing it has to do, and it, let's say, without much consequences, many consequences on its, you know, geopolitical life, in a way. It provided what was, from my understanding, an important response to Armenian Americans in particular, and also with regards to the image it shows to the world. And I can stop here.
Thank you. I think we can open it up to a discussion, but I'd like to start with, if you have a question for Dr. Zarifian, you